Hello and welcome to the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. We're located at 277 King Street in Amherstburg, and this museum is in existence because of the amazing work and dedication of our founders, Mac and Betty Simpson, along with amazing community builders in Amherstburg and the surrounding area. My name is Lorene and I'm the assistant curator here at the museum, and I'm excited to give you a tour today.
Hello, my name is Mary Catherine and I'm the curator here at the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. Right now we're standing inside the Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was also used as a terminal station for the Underground Railroad, one of many all across Canada. Slavery existed in Canada for over 200 years before it was abolished on August 1st of 1834. So that meant people were able to come and escape into Canada. They'd be considered free people once they arrived here. Amherstburg was seen as a really attractive place for people to cross over into Canada because it lies along one of the narrowest points of the Detroit River, and it's not directly across from a larger city like Sandwich in Windsor is across from Detroit. Unfortunately, we don't know how many people came across into Amherstburg during the whole of the Underground Railroad period, but there was anecdotal evidence that after 1855, there were about 30 people crossing into Amherstburg per day. And at one point, there were more black people in Amherstburg than there were white people. Through the whole of the Underground Railroad, they estimate between 30,000 to 40,000 people came up through Canada. Unfortunately, we don't know exactly how many people came through Amherstburg, but we estimate there are quite a number of people that came through here in this region. Many people did end up staying here in Amherstburg and building their lives here, while others continued on their Underground Railroad journey onto other black settlements in the region, such as the Buxton settlement, which was known as the Elgin settlement, and the Uncle Tom's Cabin site, which was at that time known as the Don settlement. This church, as I mentioned, was built in 1848 and was established by Reverend Noah C.W. Cannon, and the congregation began after that point to congregate here in the stone building in 1848. There are many different ways that people would cross the river into Amherstburg. Some people, if they were lucky, they could get boated across by an abolitionist. So that's someone who was risking their lives and their livelihoods to help bring people across to freedom into Canada. Some people, they would maybe stow away in a ferry that was leaving from Ohio or Michigan, or even board as a passenger on those ferries and come to this region. And in most extreme cases, people did actually swim across the river, which would have been really dangerous to do so because of the rushing current. The river itself is not as deep as it is now, but it would have been really dangerous to cross because of that current. In the wintertime, people would also cross the frozen ice into Amherstburg, and some people would cross over onto Balboa Island first before coming into Amherstburg. When people made it across into Amherstburg, they would seek out places like the Nazarene African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was a terminal station on the Underground Railroad, so the end of their Underground Railroad journey. So people would seek out these places for shelter, food, clothing, and whatever the congregation could provide for them. This church has a storied history of many uses, so it was almost like a community center where people could gather as a community, and also as it functioned as a school for a time being until one was opened just down the street as a segregated school in Amherstburg from 1850 to 1910. The church, as we're standing at now, represents a renovation that was done by the congregation in 1888. So they actually raised the roof about 6 feet from where it was originally, and they added a pressed tin roof as well. They added the choir loft as an addition to the back end of the church as well. Also added in the renovation were the Gothic-style windows, as you'll see here in the church right now. They originally had a painted glass in them. Right now we have a historic reproduction glass. They also added the wainscoting around the perimeter of the room as well. As you'll see, some of the pews are missing. So the pews behind me, those were also added to the church in 1888. And the ones behind me have been refinished over time.
So this is the Taylor Cabin. It's named after George Taylor, and he was an African American who escaped enslavement in Kentucky. He went on to fight in the Civil War and was given $100 for his service after he was honorably discharged. Now, he came to Canada in 1870, and he lived in this cabin as an elderly man, and he lived here with his daughter Emma, his son-in-law Thomas Thompson, and their daughter Azalea. Now, it's also important to share that Thomas Thompson, his son-in-law, was actually the very first Black person to own this cabin, so he also plays an important part of the story. Now, they would have lived here quite comfortably using artifacts like the ones that you're going to see in this cabin, and I'm going to point out a couple of them to you as well. Now, I should share that these artifacts were not owned by George and his family. These were actually donated by local Black families, which to me is just as significant because it really does help paint a picture of what life was like at the time. Now, one of the artifacts I want to share with you is this plow here. This plow was actually donated by the Hearst family, and the Hearst family is a pretty well-known family in Amherstburg. Wayne Hearst was actually the very first mayor of African descent in Amherstburg, and it was his father, Lorne, who donated it to the museum. Now, the plow was actually forged by their ancestor, George Thompson. He was previously enslaved in a blacksmith, and to me, having an artifact like this connected to your family is really significant. As someone who studies the local families in this area, a lot of times you'll find things like birth records and census records, a photograph if you're really lucky, but to find an artifact like this, I think is pretty significant because it's such an impressive piece that is connected to this family. Another artifact that I wanted to show you is right here. It's this birthing chair. Now, this birthing chair actually has names and dates of children who were born in the chair carved onto the chair, which I always love telling people about because it always gets this impressed expression once I tell them about it, because it literally has a person's written declaration of coming into this world written on the chair. So I think it's a pretty impressive piece. Now, there's another part of the cabin that I wanted to share, and it's just to my right here. This space is actually a cellar. We do get a lot of people asking us if it was used to hide people in the Underground Railroad, but it actually wasn't. We don't have any evidence of that. But what I will say, though, is that it does give us the opportunity to introduce the fact that people did come to Canada and weren't completely safe once they came here. There's a lot of myths that exist in Canadian history in terms of the Underground Railroad and Black settlement, and that's one of them, that people were 100% safe once they came over here. That's not true at all. So this space here, it is actually an example of more modern history in terms of a cellar, but there were spaces in Essex County where people did actually hide. For example, if you go to our church, which you've actually done, you're going to see a space near the piano. We believe that there was a trap door there based on the information from previous curators, but we don't have the written evidence to prove that. But what I will say, though, is that it does fit the structural history because there is a basement below it, and also the fact that the museum was a terminus of the Underground Railroad and was so close to the waterfront. It certainly does make sense with the history. So again, this space here, it was used as a cellar, and we don't actually have evidence proving that it was used to hide people, but there were spaces in Essex County that did do that. Now, a little bit more about the current history of the museum. If you remember, there was a little girl, Azalea, that I mentioned. That's George Taylor's granddaughter. She actually lived in this cabin with her husband, William Wilson, and he lived here into the 1970s. Now, he updated the cabin to have more modern conveniences like electricities. So if you look up, you'll see these double screw holes, and those actually are where the electrical wires were fed through. He also had vents for heating, and there was plaster on the walls too, but that was taken down with time. They wanted to make it look more original to the time period. And by they, I mean the museum. There is also an upstairs to the cabin, which you're welcome to take a look at as well. There's some interesting artifacts that are up there. That space started out more as a small attic space, but it was built up to be more of a livable second story. And there's some interesting artifacts upstairs that you might want to take a look at. Back in the cabinet, I had mentioned that there are many myths that exist in Canadian history in terms of Black history, and one of them is that slavery didn't exist in Canada. That is false. We had slavery here in Canada until 1834, and after 1834, once you touched Canadian soil, you were free. But before that, the opposite occurred. And one example of that is found in this display case here, and it talks about Matthew Elliott, who was an enslaver in Amherstburg, and his property is roughly 2 minutes away from the museum. And he owned roughly 60 enslaved persons. And one example that we really like to highlight in this case is this iron ring here. Now, this iron ring was actually embedded in a tree, and it was used to tie up an enslaved person and punish them. probably for not doing anything wrong at all, but this is a clear example of how we have to look to our own history in terms of slavery in Canada and not look to the United States to tell our own story.
This is the Watkins family trunk. It has been graciously loaned to us as a long-term loan by the Watkins family, and it has a very long and storied history about the origins of this trunk. According to family lore, the trunk was used by Alan Watkins to transport two of his children as they escaped through the Underground Railroad to freedom in Canada. Thank you for joining us on the tour of the Amherstburg Freedom Museum. We hope you've learned a little about Black history in Canada, and we'd love to have you come visit the museum and learn a lot more about Black history and why it's important. Thank you for visiting.